When my son told me I wasn't welcome for Christmas, I just smiled, got into my car, and drove back home. 2 days later, my phone had over 30 missed calls. Before I continue with this story, please let me know in the comments below where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up to family members who took your quiet generosity for granted and mistook it for weakness, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. My name is Calvin Foster. I'm 68 years old, and I retired after a long career as a logistics director for a major freight operations company. The foundation of my entire professional life rested on three things: identifying inefficiencies, optimizing supply chains, and recognizing precisely when a complex system had completely broken down from its core. For 4 decades, I calculated variables, anticipated structural failures, and executed solutions with absolute precision and zero emotion. On Christmas Eve, the only variable I failed to calculate accurately was my own son's sheer arrogance. The night air in the Denver suburbs was bitterly cold, a dry, biting frost that cut right through my heavy wool coat. I was standing alone on the expansive porch of a sprawling home in an affluent, gated community. It was a magnificent property, a clear symbol of success, financial stability, and long-term wealth. The front lawn was immaculately manicured, covered in a thin, shimmering layer of fresh frost that caught the sharp light of the expensive cast-iron lanterns along the driveway. I shifted the heavy, awkward cardboard box I was holding against my chest. Inside were carefully wrapped gifts for my grandchildren, encased in thick red paper and tied with neat silver ribbons. The box pressed painfully against my ribs, making it hard to breathe, but I held it steady anyway. Through the heavy, custom mahogany front door, I could hear the muted bass of festive music vibrating into the driveway. I could hear the warm, lively laughter spilled through the windows, cutting right through the freezing night. Shadowy silhouettes danced across the expensive blinds of the formal dining room. A lavish holiday gathering was in full swing inside, completely sealed off from the winter chill. I adjusted my posture on the frozen concrete porch, my leather soles making a faint scraping noise. I didn't ring the doorbell immediately. I just stood there observing. That was my nature. Decades of professional habit always overruled my personal impulses. I watched as my breath formed thick white clouds in the freezing air, disappearing into the dark night. I listened to the faint clinking of crystal glasses and the overlapping voices of a dozen people enjoying a high-end feast. I pulled back the sleeve of my coat and checked my watch. It was 7:55 in the evening. With my usual punctuality, I had bypassed the holiday traffic to arrive precisely on time for the family dinner we had agreed upon weeks ago. Or rather, a dinner I had reasonably assumed was a standing, unquestioned invitation, the bare minimum expectation between a father and his only son during the holidays. Finally, I reached out with a cold finger and pressed the illuminated brass doorbell. A deep chime echoed loudly through the home's grand foyer. The laughter inside didn't stop, but I soon heard clear, heavy footsteps heading toward the door. The lock clicked loudly. The heavy brass handle turned, and the large mahogany door swung inward, immediately releasing a wave of heat, filled with the rich scents of roast meat, expensive cinnamon, and fresh pine needles. The warmth hit my cold face like a comforting wave, but any feeling of comfort vanished the second I saw the man standing in the doorway. My son, Aaron, stood right in the entry frame. At 34, he was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blazer over a crisp white dress shirt, his collar casually unbuttoned. He looked exceptionally successful, polished, capable, and completely in control. But the very second his eyes confirmed, it was me standing on his porch. His entire posture shifted violently. His shoulders stiffened into a rigid line. His jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles pulsing in his cheeks. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't step aside to let his elderly father inside, away from the biting wind. Instead, he took an aggressive step forward, planting his expensive leather shoes firmly on the threshold, transforming his body into a physical barrier to block me out completely. Music pulsed loudly behind him. I could see the glow of a massive 12-foot Christmas tree in the living room, adorned with hundreds of warm white lights and delicate crystal ornaments. I watched my son silently, waiting for the standard greeting, waiting for the simple invitation to step inside from the freezing cold. I waited for him to reach out and relieve me of the heavy box that was slowly numbing my arms. Aaron did none of those things. He grabbed the edge of the heavy door, pulling it slightly inward to narrow the opening and deliberately limit my view of the interior. His eyes darted nervously over his shoulder, scanning the hallway behind him with intense paranoia before locking back onto me. His breathing was visibly shallow, his expression a volatile mix of deep irritation, intense embarrassment, and unprovoked hostility. He glanced down at the box in my hands, then slowly looked back up at my face. He didn't say, "Merry Christmas." He didn't say, "Hello." He just stared at me, actively blocking the entrance, treating me not as a father arriving for a holiday celebration, but as an intruder, an unwelcomed delivery driver, rudely interrupting a private, high-profile event. The bitter wind howled behind me, whipping against the hem of my coat while I stood straight on the icy porch, waiting on a son who was actively refusing to let his father inside. An agonizing silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, broken only by the sounds of the party inside. Aaron swallowed hard, his throat moving nervously. His eyes flickered, avoiding direct contact with mine. He shifted his weight uneasily from one foot to the other, his hand gripping the door frame like a shield against my presence. When he finally spoke, his voice was hushed, almost a whisper, as if he was terrified the important people inside might overhear him talking to the man standing out in the cold. "We didn't expect you to show up, Dad." The words were spoken with a chilling, clinical detachment. They hung in the freezing air, almost solidifying before they reached my ears. I stood motionless, the box pressing heavy against my forearms. I stared at him while my mind processed the massive weight behind those 6 simple words. Didn't expect me to show up. On Christmas Eve. At my only son's house. Aaron glanced over his shoulder again, his anxiety spiking as a burst of laughter erupted from the dining room. "Brooke's family is here," he continued, his tone turning sharp, defensive, and arrogant. "This is a private dinner. We only planned for immediate family. Immediate family." The phrase echoed relentlessly through my mind. I didn't blink. I didn't offer a physical reaction. I simply let the brutal words settle into the logical, analytical framework of my mind. My gaze shifted past Aaron's shoulder. The hallway behind him was wide, grand, and spotless. My eyes swept across the dark oak hardwood floors, glowing perfectly beneath the warm recessed lighting. I saw the detailed trim work along the spotless white walls and the imported Italian marble in the foyer. My mind, sharpened by 40 years of corporate logistics and detailed financial audits, instantly recalled the exact, undeniable figures. $120,000. That was the precise amount on the cashier's chesser I personally handed to the title company 3 years ago. It was a non-refundable wire transfer drawn directly from my personal retirement savings to cover the required 20% down payment for this sprawling suburban home. I had covered the high closing costs out of my own pocket. I paid for the thorough home inspections without hesitation. My legal name was still listed as the primary holder on the deed to the property, because Aaron's personal credit history at the time was nowhere near strong enough to secure the massive mortgage on his own. I was the literal financial foundation upon which this massive illusion of success was built. Yet, standing on the icy concrete, listening to the party inside, I was being told I wasn't qualified to be considered immediate family. Down the hallway, I heard the crisp click of expensive high heels against the hardwood. I shifted my focus, slightly. Brooke, my 32-year-old daughter-in-law, stepped gracefully into the hallway. Los into the hallway. She wore a tailored emerald silk dress, holding a delicate crystal champagne glass in her manicured hand. She stopped near the entrance of the dining room, turned her head, and looked straight toward the front door. Her eyes met mine through the narrow gap Aaron was allowing. There was zero surprise in her expression, no confusion whatsoever, only a cold, calculated awareness. She knew exactly what was happening on the porch. She knew precisely why Aaron was blocking the doorway. She held my gaze for 3 long, silent seconds. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She didn't offer a single word of greeting or apology. She simply raised her chin with a cold, dismissive elegance, turned around, and walked back toward the warmth and laughter of the party, disappearing from sight. That single gesture confirmed everything. This wasn't a tragic misunderstanding or a simple scheduling mistake. This was a deliberate, calculated exclusion. They had meticulously planned this gathering with the specific goal of keeping me out. They had invited her entire extended family, prepared a lavish feast, and intentionally left out the man who was literally paying for the roof over their heads. Aaron watched my eyes track his wife's movement. He turned back to face me, his jaw set defensively, his body braced for a shouting match. He expected me to yell. He expected me to demand entry. He expected me to throw the fact that I bought the house right in his face and force my way inside. He was waiting for an emotional, hysterical scene from a desperate father clinging to an ungrateful child, a dramatic confrontation that would justify his arrogance and validate his decision to treat me like a nuisance. He completely misunderstood the man standing in front of him. A logistics director doesn't scream at a broken machine. A logistics director identifies the failing component, isolates it completely, and removes it from the operation with surgical precision. I didn't raise my voice by a single decibel. I didn't let an ounce of betrayal show on my face. I entered a state of absolute, quiet calm. I studied Aaron carefully, noting the beads of nervous sweat on his forehead, even as the winter wind blew through the open door. I looked at his expensive clothes, his defensive posture, and the sheer arrogance he projected while refusing to let me inside. I processed the data quickly. This relationship, as a functioning family unit, had completely failed. The massive emotional and financial investment had yielded a total negative return. The son I raised, the boy I sacrificed decades of my life to protect, support, and provide for, no longer existed. In his place stood an entitled, ungrateful stranger who viewed me as nothing more than a silent, distant funding source. I smiled. It wasn't the warm smile of a loving father. It was a thin, pragmatic curve of the lips, the exact expression you wear at a high-stakes negotiation table when you realize your opponent just made a catastrophic miscalculation. I slowly lowered the heavy cardboard box containing the wrapped gifts. I set it down gently and precisely on the icy concrete, right near the tips of Aaron's polished leather shoes. The silver ribbons fluttered slightly in the harsh wind. I stood up straight, adjusting the collar of my heavy coat. "Merry Christmas, Aaron," I said. My voice was steady, completely devoid of anger or sorrow. It was the tone of a professional confirming the termination of a major contract. Aaron blinked repeatedly, his entire body visibly relaxing. He let out a long breath he had clearly been holding, a look of arrogant relief washing over his face. He had prepared for a bitter argument, and now he foolishly believed he had won a clean victory. He disastrously mistook my absolute silence for weak submission. He mistook my calm demeanor for a pathetic retreat. He genuinely believed he had successfully pushed me off the property, without a fight, establishing complete dominance over our dynamic. "Thanks, Dad," he replied, his voice dripping with condescension. "Drive safe. The roads are getting slick out there." He didn't wait for me to turn around. He immediately moved to close the heavy door. I didn't linger on the porch for another second. I turned my back and began walking slowly down the paved driveway. Right behind me, I heard the heavy mahogany door slam shut with a solid thud. The lock clicked sharply into place with a definitive metallic sound. The festive music was instantly cut off. The warm light spilling onto the porch vanished, leaving me entirely in the dark. The physical separation between us was now absolute. I walked steadily out into the rain, my foot toward my car, my footsteps crunching on the frost-covered driveway. I didn't look back at the grand house. I didn't look up at the illuminated windows where Brooke's family was drinking champagne and laughing in a home I legally owned. I just kept walking. With every step, the emotional weight of their betrayal vanished into the freezing air, replaced by an absolute, icy clarity. I reached my car, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. The cold leather pressed against my back. The interior was pitch black and dead silent. I closed the door, sealing myself inside the quiet cabin. I took hold of the cold steering wheel and looked straight ahead through the frosted windshield at the affluent neighborhood. For 3 whole years, I had quietly maintained this grand lifestyle for him. For 3 years, I shielded him from the harsh reality of the massive financial burdens he had so recklessly taken on. I protected him, supported him, and enabled his growing arrogance. That era ended tonight. I reached out and pressed the ignition button. The engine roared to life with a steady, reliable hum that sliced through the quiet suburban street. The modern dashboard lit up, casting a cool blue light through the dark cabin. My eyes locked onto the glowing digital clock on the center console. It read exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. I leaned back against the headrest, my mind rapidly organizing the necessary operational steps for the immediate future. The date was December 24th. For the past 36 consecutive months, without a single failure or delay, an automatic transfer of $3,800 had been drawn from my primary checking account to cover the mortgage on the property Aaron and Brooke lived in. That transfer was scheduled by the bank to initiate precisely at midnight on the 25th of every month, ensuring the funds cleared well before the due date. I stared at the glowing blue numbers on the clock. 8 o'clock. I had 4 hours. 4 hours before the bank servers executed the automatic transfer. 4 hours before another massive sum of my hard-earned personal capital was quietly deposited into the joint account of the people who had just locked me out in the cold and declared I wasn't part of their family. I placed my hand on the gear shift and pulled it down into drive. The tires gripped the frosty asphalt as I pulled away from the curb. I didn't drive with reckless anger. I drove with the calm, methodical precision of an executive, executing a deliberate corporate restructuring. The internal shift was complete. I was no longer a heartbroken father, begging for affection from an ungrateful son. I was the primary financial stakeholder, taking decisive action to liquidate a toxic asset. The upcoming confrontation hadn't been avoided when he closed that door. It had simply been delayed by 4 hours. The drive back to my side of town took 24 minutes. I didn't turn on the radio, and I didn't turn up the heat. The absolute quiet filled the car, and I let it settle around me, freezing any remaining sentiments into solid ice. I pulled into the narrow driveway of my townhouse, a modest brick home. There were no imported marble foyers here, no soaring pillars or wrought iron gates. I preferred it that way. It was efficient, practical, and required no unnecessary maintenance. I opened the front door and stepped inside. The air in the living room was still and quiet. In the corner stood a small, artificial Christmas tree I had put up 2 weeks ago, dutifully retrieving it from the garage in anticipation of spending the holidays with family. Its lights were unplugged, the plastic branches swallowed by shadows. I didn't reach for the power cord. The holiday delusion had officially expired. I took off my heavy wool coat and hung it neatly over the back of a dining chair. Bypassing the living area entirely, I walked straight into the small, spare room I used as an office. This room was my operational center. A sturdy oak desk, a leather office chair, and a high-performance desktop computer connected to dual monitors. For 40 years in logistics, this was the exact environment where I handled system failures. Whenever a supplier breached a contract or a network collapsed, I sat in a chair just like this, isolated the broken variables, and eliminated the liabilities. Tonight, the failing component was my own son. I pressed the power button on the computer tower. The cooling fans whirred to life, a steady mechanical sound that grounded me. The dual screens flickered, illuminating my face in the dark room. I sat down and placed my hands flat on the desk. I needed to act with complete objectivity. Aaron had just made it clear that he viewed his life as entirely independent of me. He truly believed his success was self-made. He had looked me in the eye and turned me away, completely ignoring the fact that his lifestyle existed solely because of my capital. It was time to introduce him to the cold, hard numbers of his reality. I opened a secure browser window and navigated to my primary banking portal. I entered my complex login credentials with quick practiced keystrokes. A 2-factor authentication code buzzed on my phone. I entered the digits, and the main dashboard loaded instantly on my primary monitor. My eyes swept over the orderly rows of financial data. I managed my retirement assets with the same rigorous oversight I once applied to corporate budgets. Every dollar had a designated purpose, a set trajectory, and an expected return. I moved the cursor directly to the tab labeled Scheduled Recurring Transfers. The page refreshed, displaying a single recurring transaction. The recipient account was named Aaron Foster. The scheduled execution date was tomorrow, December 25th, at midnight. The exact transfer amount was $3,800. I stared at that number. $3,800. Every month for the past 3 years, that exact amount had quietly left my retirement account and flowed into my son's account, solely to keep his massive mortgage current. 3 years ago, when Aaron first came to me, begging for help with a down payment, I reviewed his finances. I knew immediately that his salary as a regional sales manager was nowhere near enough to cover the monthly payments, the high property taxes, and the upkeep of such a large estate. But he had looked at me with desperate eyes. Promising a major promotion was right around the corner, and swearing this house was the only way Brooke would agree to start a family. So I stepped in, as the silent benefactor. I legally put my name on the deed to guarantee the loan, and I set up the automatic transfer to protect him from the crushing weight of his own financial over-execution. I did it out of blind, foolish affection. But affection, like any operational asset, must be revoked the moment it is weaponized against the provider. I moved the mouse over the highlighted text for the recurring transfer. A drop-down menu appeared. I skipped the options to edit or pause the transaction. I scrolled down to the final red option labeled Permanently Cancel Transaction and clicked it. A secondary warning screen popped up, an automatic safeguard asking me to confirm the permanent action, warning that future scheduled payments would not be processed and could lead to severe penalty fees. I didn't hesitate for a single second. I clicked Confirm. The screen flickered briefly before displaying a green check mark. The $3,800 transfer vanished from the active ledger. Just like that, the invisible safety net holding Aaron's carefully curated life above financial collapse was erased. However, as a logistics director, I knew that cutting a single line is never enough to fully decommission a broken system. You have to isolate all secondary support lines to prevent further damage. I shifted my attention to the Credit Management tab and pulled up the file for a joint platinum emergency credit card. 2 years ago, Aaron had called me in a total panic, claiming his car's transmission had blown out and he had zero liquid funds to cover the repair. I opened this line of credit, backed directly by my own pristine credit score, and mailed the physical card to his address. The strict verbal agreement was that the card was strictly for catastrophic emergencies or essential groceries if they ever found themselves temporarily short on cash. I navigated to the cardholder controls. A simple toggle switch labeled Temporarily. Lock card appeared on the screen. I ignored it completely. Scrolled down to the security options and selected the protocol for a compromised card. I clicked the button to permanently freeze account and revoke all authorized users. Another confirmation screen appeared, warning me that any cards currently in circulation would be declined immediately at any point of sale. I clicked Confirm. The Platinum card status changed instantly from active to frozen. The financial guillotine had officially fallen. I leaned back into my leather chair and took a slow, deep breath of the cool air in the room. My financial liabilities were now completely closed out. I had successfully severed the massive flow of cash into Aaron's household. Yet, staring at the frozen credit account on the glowing monitor, a sudden, cold curiosity took hold of me. The outstanding balance on that emergency card was shockingly higher than it should have been. To verify the absolute necessity of my actions, I needed to know the full extent of the damage before closing the file completely. I leaned forward and clicked on the detailed transaction history for the frozen card, fully prepared to conduct a thorough forensic audit of my son's recent spending. The blue light from the dual monitors cast a cool, pale glow across the dark office. The confirmation screen faded away, replaced by the primary dashboard for the credit account. A digital padlock icon confirmed that the Platinum card was successfully frozen, cutting off their access to the funds, but their access to the funds. The displayed in the top right corner demanded my immediate attention. There it was, bold and glaring against the white background, $42,815. I stared at the figure, the steady hum of the computer tower the only sound in the quiet townhouse. The absolute limit on that account was $50,000. They had almost completely maxed it out. I clicked the mouse, the sharp sound echoing in the silent room, and navigated to the detailed transaction history. I didn't approach this as a father looking at his son's financial mistakes. I approached it the way I had handled corporate logistics for 40 years, conducting a forensic audit on a failed asset to pinpoint the exact source of the drain. I downloaded the statements for the past 12 months, straight to my hard drive, and opened the first file. The original arrangement made 2 years ago was crystal clear. Aaron had called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice tight with manufactured panic, claiming his transmission had failed and left him stranded, unable to commute for his sales job. He swore his checking account was overdrawn, claiming unexpected medical bills, for Brooke had left them broke. I listened. I believed him, and I took action. I sent the Platinum card to their address via overnight mail, setting strict, unbreakable parameters. The account was exclusively for true emergencies, critical car repairs, sudden medical expenses, or basic groceries if they genuinely ran out of food before payday. It was never intended to fund their everyday lifestyle. My eyes scanned down to the first page of the most recent billing cycle. I looked for the names of local auto repair shops. I looked for standard supermarket purchases for basic groceries. There wasn't a single one. Instead, my gaze locked onto a charge from just 3 weeks prior. $850 at a high-end luxury day spa in downtown Denver. I highlighted that row. I cross-referenced the date in my head. 3 weeks ago, Aaron called to ask if I could cover the cost of a plumber because their water heater had supposedly burst. While I was transferring emergency funds from my checking account to keep my son from freezing in his own home, Brooke was spending nearly $1,000 of my money on hot stone massages and imported facials. I scrolled through the history, clicking methodically. The pattern of deception wasn't subtle, it was reckless. It was the spending behavior of someone operating under complete impunity and zero accountability. On November 14, there was a $1,200 charge at a designer boutique. On November 18, a $400 at an upscale steakhouse on a Thursday night, when Aaron had explicitly told me he was working double shifts just to keep their heads above water. On November 22, a direct payment of $2,500 went to an exclusive private country club. I stopped scrolling and pulled up the detailed receipt for that transaction. It wasn't a one-time guest fee. It was a recurring monthly membership, complete with a massive dining bill that detailed aged wines and premium imported steaks. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of their entitlement. A country club membership. They were actively socializing with the city's elite, projecting the image of a wealthy, successful young couple, while I sat alone in my modest townhouse, quietly bankrolling their performance. I pulled up the statement for October. The data told a story completely detached from the narrative Aaron had fed me during our brief, hurried calls. October 9 showed $3,000 for premium business class flights to Aspen. October 11 through 15 showed $4,500 at a luxury ski resort. I remembered that exact week vividly. Aaron had canceled our scheduled Sunday lunch, claiming he was completely buried under a massive work project, and that Brooke was battling a severe case of the flu. He had sounded so exhausted on the phone, weighed down by the stress of providing for his family. I felt a deep ache of paternal sympathy for him. I even offered to bring over soup and medicine. He turned it down quickly, insisting they just needed rest. The raw financial data now flickered brightly on my monitor, completely shattering the illusion of the struggling son. They weren't resting, and they weren't sick. They were sitting in a luxury ski lodge, drinking expensive champagne, charging every single drop of their lavish vacation to an emergency credit card belonging to the father they left behind. Betrayal isn't always a sudden act. It can be a slow, calculated extraction. I opened September's statement, then August's, then July's. The exact same pattern repeated with sickening consistency. Tens of thousands of dollars flowed into designer stores, cosmetic procedures, and lavish entertainment. They hadn't just bent the rules of our financial arrangement. They had dismantled them entirely. They saw me exactly as I had feared on that icy porch hours earlier, not as a father, but as a silent, endless engine of capital, perfectly designed to fund their boundless vanity. They operated under the absolute assumption that I was too old, too naive, or simply too desperate for their affection to ever audit the actual ledgers. They believed my care for Aaron would permanently blind me to the obvious mathematical contradictions in their lifestyle. They assumed they could bleed my resources dry while treating me with absolute disrespect at their front-end door. They mistook my quiet nature for permanent weakness. I didn't feel a sting of sadness. The shelf life for emotional vulnerability expired. The moment Brooke turned her back on me in that hallway, what I felt now was a cold, razor-sharp focus. Every transaction highlighted on my screen was another piece of evidence confirming the reality of the situation. I compiled the statements, saving the files into a new folder on my desktop labeled simply Evidence. I had already cut off the massive monthly mortgage transfer. I had permanently frozen the credit card account. Their entire financial ecosystem, built on unearned capital, had now been completely severed at the source. The fallout would be swift, uncompromising, and entirely of their own making. I logged out of the credit card portal, returning to my primary banking dashboard, ready to shut down the computer for the night. The initial phase was complete. But as my cursor hovered over the sign-out button, a small, flashing red icon in the top left corner caught my attention. It was a high-priority alert from my integrated credit monitoring service, something I had signed up for decades ago and rarely needed to check. My hand froze over the mouse. The alert was flagged as urgent, time-stamped exactly 3 weeks prior, buried beneath routine digital notifications I had previously overlooked. I clicked the red icon. The page loaded slowly, the spinning wheel, contrasting sharply with the steady rhythm of my pulse. I had audited the credit cards and severed the mortgage. But when the security portal finally opened to reveal the details of an urgent credit inquiry, I realized with absolute clarity that the financial exploitation I had just uncovered was merely the surface of a much deeper problem. The red alert icon kept flashing on my screen. I clicked the notification, and the credit monitoring portal loaded slowly. I watched the spinning blue circle while my mind ran through standard possibilities. An unexpected flag, a minor verification test. For over 40 years, I had maintained a flawless credit score. Aside from the primary mortgage I took on for Aaron, I had zero outstanding debt. I owned my townhouse outright and never applied for unnecessary revolving credit lines. The page finally populated, displaying a detailed report. It was an official notification regarding a hard credit inquiry initiated 21 days ago. The institution that launched the inquiry was not my standard, highly regulated bank, but a regional credit union on the other side of town, known for approving high-risk, quick cash loans. I leaned closer to the dual monitors. The alert detailed the exact nature of the inquiry. An application for a home equity line of credit, officially approved for $75,000. The collateral listed to secure this massive line of credit was the very suburban property where my son and his wife currently lived. I sat motionless in my leather chair, my breathing slowing to a deliberate rhythm. I applied the same structured logic from my logistics background to the information on the screen, breaking down the legal framework of the asset. I had provided the $120,000 down payment for that property. My legal name, and mine alone, was listed as the primary holder on the actual deed. Aaron was categorized merely as a secondary occupant. He had zero legal authority to leverage that property for cash. To secure a line of credit against that specific house, the credit union would strictly require authorization paperwork from the primary deed holder. They would need my personal presence, state-issued identification, or a verified digital signature. I had provided none of those things. I had never spoken to anyone at that regional credit union. The logical conclusion was crystal clear. Aaron hadn't just bypassed my permission. He had deliberately impersonated me. He had forged my signature on official financial documents to illegally extract liquid cash from an asset he didn't own. The air in my home office felt heavy. The previous credit card discoveries were alarming, but they represented a breakdown of trust. Spending my money on luxury spa days and country club dinners was a display of greed and moral failure. But this was a completely different matter. This was fraud, identity theft, and financial exploitation. My own son had crossed the line from a dependent parasite to a desperate offender. I looked at the exact date of the credit inquiry, 21 days ago. My mind flipped back through my calendar, accessing my memory of schedules and appointments. 21 days ago was Thanksgiving week. A vivid memory surfaced. On a Tuesday evening right before the holiday, Aaron had invited me over for a surprisingly brief, casual dinner. I remembered sitting at his expensive kitchen island, while Brooke conveniently left to run errands. Aaron poured me a glass of wine, acting unusually warm and talkative. Halfway through the evening, he pulled a thick stack of complex paperwork from his briefcase, claiming it related to a new corporate compensation plan for his sales job. He told me he needed a character reference signature for a background check required by his new clients. He smoothly turned the pages, isolating a signature line at the very bottom of a text-dense document. And I signed it. I blindly put pen to paper, signing my legal name out of complete trust for my own blood. He had slipped that authorization page directly into a stack of routine corporate forms. He had looked me straight in the eye, handed me a glass of wine, and guided my hand to execute the instrument of my own financial exposure. He had weaponized my unconditional trust to access $75,000 in liquid cash. Then, 3 weeks later, he stood on his icy front porch, physically blocking me from entering his home, telling me I didn't count as immediate family. I didn't slam my fist on the oak desk or yell into the empty room. My internal framework underwent a complete shift. The father, who tirelessly supported his son, no longer existed. I was now a primary stakeholder dealing with an adversary who was actively stripping away my assets. I left the credit monitoring site and navigated directly to the online portal for that regional credit union. Using the reference number provided in the alert, I initiated an immediate fraud hold on the newly opened credit line. I bypassed standard customer service prompts, utilizing automated federal fraud reporting tools. Within 3 minutes, the $75,000 account was frozen, flagged for active identity theft, and locked pending a mandatory investigation. I didn't stop there. I meticulously downloaded digital copies of the fraudulent application, the timestamped login IP addresses, and the scans of the forged signature page. I saved every piece of raw data directly into the encrypted evidence folder on my desktop. Every digital footprint he left behind was now secured, preserved, and ready for deployment. I glanced at the clock on the office wall. The second hand swept past 12. It was officially midnight on Christmas morning. The automatic mortgage transfer had officially failed to process. The joint credit card was completely disabled, and the fraudulent line of credit was now flagged in the banking system as a serious financial crime. Boss. The ecosystem supporting their lifestyle had been completely dismantled. I picked up my phone from the desk. The time for silent observation was over. It was time to take decisive action. The digital clock on the desk silently jumped to 6 in the morning. Outside my window, the sky was a deep, dark black with no hint of dawn. It was Christmas morning. By normal standards, I should have been sleeping or waking up to the smell of brewing coffee, enjoying the quiet morning. Instead, I sat motionless under the glow of the dual monitors, having not slept a single minute. I didn't feel a trace of physical fatigue. My mind operated with absolute clarity, a level of focus I hadn't experienced since my days managing global logistics networks. The father who had driven to the suburbs hours ago, hoping for a warm family gathering, was gone. He had been completely removed from my mindset, replaced by a director who had just uncovered a massive internal operation. I spent the early morning hours organizing the digital evidence. I didn't waste time looking at old family photos or wondering where things had gone wrong. Emotional reflection was useless. I focused entirely on the raw data. I printed time-stamped bank logs showing the exact moment the fraudulent credit line was created, along with login locations that matched the network address of Aaron's home. Finally, I printed scans of the signature page from the loan application. I stared at the ink. It was my name, an exact imitation of my handwriting's rhythm and slant, affixed to a document I had never authorized. I placed the papers into a fresh manila folder, aligning the edges with absolute precision. The physical proof of my son's actions was now organized and ready. I reached across the desk and picked up bypassing my phone, scrolling down my professional directories until I stopped on one name: Stephen Porter. Stephen was not a family lawyer who negotiated gentle compromises or sought emotional reconciliations. Stephen was an aggressive corporate litigator. Throughout my career, I had utilized his firm to execute corporate restructurings, liquidate failing assets, and enforce contracts against defaulting suppliers. He was a thorough professional who specialized in debt recovery asset protection. Calling him on a holiday morning was a clear statement of my intent. This was no longer a family disagreement. It was the systematic dismantling of a hostile situation. I pressed call and brought the phone to my ear, knowing he wouldn't answer at 6 in the morning on a major holiday. Nor did I want him to. A voicemail would provide a clean, documented record of instructions, without empty pleasantries. After 3 rings, the call connected to his automated professional greeting. The recording sounded clear in the quiet room. "Stephen, this is Calvin," I said, my voice completely stripped of warmth or hesitation. "Aaron forged my signature to apply for a $75,000 home equity line of credit. Draft a 30-day notice to quit and freeze the title on the property. We go to war on Monday." I moved the phone away from my ear and disconnected the call. The sheer finality of that action hung heavy in the room, but it brought no sense of grief. It brought a profound, sweeping sense of order. That sprawling suburban house, his grand illusion of massive success, the carefully curated image he projected to his wealthy neighbors, all of it was built on stolen money and wire fraud. I had just set the legal machinery in motion that would completely demolish that foundation. I stood up from my heavy leather office chair. My joints were somewhat stiff from sitting bolt upright all night, but my posture was completely straight. I walked into my dimly lit kitchen and brewed a pot of black coffee. I didn't turn on the television to watch cheerful holiday parades. I didn't look out the window to watch happy neighbors exchanging gifts. I simply sat at my modest kitchen island, poured the dark, bitter coffee, and waited. I had completely severed his mortgage payments. I had permanently deactivated his primary emergency credit card. I had locked down the fraudulent credit line, triggering an active federal fraud investigation. And I had legally weaponized the title to the very house he slept in. The financial oxygen was cut off. I knew precisely how the remaining variables would react. Aaron and Brooke were currently asleep in their lavish master bedroom, completely unaware that their fake reality had just been liquidated. They believed they had won. They truly believed they had successfully cast aside a powerless old man. It would take 48 hours for the global banking network to process the full magnitude of the shutdown I had unleashed. I took a slow, steady sip of my coffee, mentally preparing for the chaotic panic that was mathematically guaranteed to follow. The silence in my townhouse was absolute. I knew the storm was gathering momentum. No notifications came on Christmas Day. No text messages appeared on my screen. No routine holiday greetings were sent. My phone sat quietly on the edge of the kitchen island. In previous years, I would have found that absolute silence deeply unsettling. I would have manufactured a weak excuse to call them, hoping to catch the sound of my grandchildren in the background. Now, that silence was validating. It was absolute mathematical confirmation of my hypothesis. Without my continuous financial utility, I simply ceased to exist in their reality. December 26th arrived and passed with the same deep emptiness. I spent those 48 hours with military precision, executing my daily routine. I cleared the heavy snow from my narrow driveway. I organized paper tax documents into neat, chronological stacks. I prepared simple, efficient meals. Not once did I log into my banking portal. The automated cancellation protocol I had activated was completely foolproof. It required no further intervention. I had severed the primary supply line, and now I simply had to wait for the vacuum to do its work. The dawn of December 27th was bitterly cold and dark. I woke up precisely at 5 in the morning. I showered, shaved, and put on a clean, ironed shirt and trousers. A retired corporate logistics director does not face a crisis in pajamas. I walked into the kitchen and began my morning routine. I ground dark roast coffee beans, precisely measuring the ratio of water to grounds. The machine crackled and hissed, filling the small room with a rich, heavy aroma. I poured the black liquid into a thick ceramic mug. I walked to the kitchen island and stood motionless. My phone was resting in the exact spot where I had left it. The digital clock on the screen jumped to 7:30 in the morning. In the wealthy, sprawling suburb where Aaron and Brooke lived, 7:30 was the exact time the financial world demanded payment. It was the moment their automated lifestyle began actively interacting with the financial network. The local artisanal coffee shop, high-end fitness subscriptions, and automatic toll systems for their expensive vehicles all began sending daily authorization requests to their accounts. I took a slow, deliberate sip of coffee, the bitter warmth spreading across my tongue. At precisely 7:34, the dark screen of my phone suddenly lit up. A bright, intrusive glare broke the quiet shadows of the kitchen. The device began vibrating violently against the granite countertop, emitting a sharp, urgent ringtone. I didn't reach for it. I stood like a statue, hands wrapped tightly around the warm ceramic mug. The caller ID flashed across the screen in bold, harsh letters. Aaron. The phone rang loudly, echoing off the wooden cabinets. A second ring, then a third. It continued its frantic call until it finally switched to my automated voicemail system. The screen went dark and silence returned to the kitchen. It lasted for 42 seconds. Then, the screen lit up violently once more. The same caller ID flashed. The same frantic vibration rattled against the stone countertop. I took another slow, calculated sip of coffee. The financial guillotine had officially fallen. A catastrophic financial shockwave was currently tearing through their morning routine. Perhaps Brooke was standing at the sleek reception desk of her luxury Pilates studio, facing an embarrassed attendant while holding a platinum credit card that had just been declined. Perhaps Aaron was breaking out in a cold sweat, logging into his mobile banking app to discover that the massive mortgage transfer had failed to arrive, leaving his primary checking account severely overdrawn. The call went to voicemail a second time. It immediately began ringing a third time. I watched missed call notifications pop up on the lock screen. 3 missed calls. I felt no urge to pick up the device. Answering would only give their panic an immediate target, allowing them to redirect their fear into entitled, blinding rage toward me. Absolute silence, on the other hand, forces a hostile entity to confront the terrifying reality of their sudden isolation. The phone rang a 4th time, a 5th, a 6th. The intervals between calls grew shorter and more erratic. The violent vibration on the granite turned into a continuous, desperate hum. 9 missed calls. 12 missed calls. I walked around the kitchen island and pulled out a wooden stool. I sat down deliberately, my eyes locked on the glowing digital screen. 15 missed calls. The desperation radiating from the device was almost tangible. They had finally realized that the deep, reliable well of my capital had suddenly and permanently run dry. 20 missed calls. I imagined Aaron pacing through his spacious custom kitchen, dialing furiously, completely unable to comprehend a world where his father refused to absorb his massive liabilities. He was a man who had never faced structural consequences in his adult life. 25 missed calls. The coffee in my mug began to cool, but I did not break my focus. I watched the red notification badge swell as incoming voicemails stacked up. 28. 29. The phone began ringing again. I watched my son's name flash across the screen for the 30th consecutive time. With absolute patience, I waited for the final ring to end. The screen went dark, settling on exactly 30 missed calls. The initial storm of absolute panic had finally reached its peak. The structural collapse was now irreversible. I listened to the quiet that followed that 30th call. It was a profound, absolute silence. In my decades of managing global supply chains, I learned that the most critical moment of any catastrophic failure isn't the initial break. It's the immediate aftermath. When the failing component realizes no rescue protocol has been initiated. I knew exactly what was happening on the other end of the line. Arrogant denial was rapidly morphing into raw, existential dread. They were frantically trying to access other lines of credit, only to find every single avenue systematically blocked or maxed out by their own overconsumption. They were refreshing their banking apps praying for over and over, for a miraculous digital glitch that would restore their stolen balance. I finished the last sip of my lukewarm coffee and set the ceramic mug down on the granite countertop with a soft, dull thud. The preparation phase of my operation was officially over. They had spent 3 full years treating me like an invisible automated resource, stripped of human value. Now, they were about to experience what happens when that resource gains complete awareness and intentionally executes a total system wipe. The phone's glowing screen finally rested on the number 30. The relentless vibration against the granite stopped completely, leaving a deep silence in the kitchen. I didn't move right away. I let the silence settle over me. I finished the last few drops of black coffee and placed the ceramic mug directly into the sink, drying my hands on a cloth towel. Only then did I walk back to the kitchen island and pick up the device. I unlocked the screen and opened the voicemail application. The digital log showed a long cascading list of audio recordings, every single one from Aaron. I felt no familiar pull of paternal anxiety. What I felt was the detached focus of an auditor reviewing a series of critical system failures. I pressed play on the first message, recorded at 10:15 in the morning. The audio opened with a sharp, irritated sigh. I could immediately hear the distinct ambient noise of a high-end retail environment in the background. Soft classical music played faintly from overhead speakers while the muted, polite conversations of affluent shoppers echoed around him. Aaron's voice came through the speaker, dripping with a heavy, suffocating layer of utter condescension. He didn't ask how my holidays were. He didn't say good morning. He simply launched into an entitled reprimand. He demanded to know why the joint platinum emergency card had just been crudely declined at the register. With intense irritation, he explained that they were attending an exclusive post-Christmas designer clearance event. He claimed Brooke was currently standing at the checkout counter, suffering deep public humiliation because the terminal kept flashing a restricted account error in the background of the recording. I could hear Brooke hissing near the receiver, her words indecipherable, but undeniably filled with rage. Aaron spoke to me like an employer, addressing a negligent subordinate who had forgotten to run a mandatory software update. He ordered me to call my financial institution immediately. He told me to fix whatever technical glitch I had caused and call him back the second the funds were restored. The recording cut off with a sharp, angry click. I didn't flinch. I felt not an ounce of guilt over Brooke's public embarrassment. The money they were attempting to use for designer clothes was stolen directly from my retirement savings. The restriction wasn't a technical glitch. It was a permanent financial lockout. I tapped the delete icon and moved down the chronological list. I bypassed a dozen repetitive, angry messages demanding to know why I was ignoring his calls. I isolated the next major shift in his tone, logged at precisely 1:45 in the afternoon, and pressed play. The acoustic environment of this recording was entirely different. The soft retail music was gone. The background was quiet, except for the low, steady rumble of a luxury car engine idling. Aaron was sitting alone in his expensive SUV. The entitled arrogance from the first message had completely evaporated. In its place was a creeping, undeniable anxiety. His voice was visibly tight. He spoke much faster, tripping over his own words. He told me he had just received an automated alert from his primary lender. The $3,800 mortgage payment had failed to process. The bank had officially issued a default warning. Aaron was desperately trying to construct a plausible excuse for this catastrophic failure. He nervously suggested that I must have made a foolish mistake in my online banking settings. He tried to blame my age, claiming I had probably clicked the wrong button and accidentally disrupted the routing numbers. He ordered me to manually wire the funds to his checking account immediately to prevent severe penalties to his credit score. He was still desperately trying to maintain his illusion of independence, fundamental in his belief that I was just a confused old man who had made a clerical error. He couldn't comprehend the terrifying reality that his primary financial host had deliberately cut off the parasite. I tapped the delete icon again, erasing his anxiety from my digital archive. I skipped to the very last voicemail on the list, left just minutes ago. I pressed play and held the phone close to my ear. This was the exact moment true terror finally set in. Aaron was practically hyperventilating. His breathing was rapid and rough, echoing loudly into the microphone. His voice cracked violently, completely stripped of any remaining dignity or corporate polish. He was no longer demanding a solution. He was begging for rescue. The bank had just contacted him directly on his personal line. An agent informed him that the $75,000 home equity line of credit had been permanently frozen. The account hadn't encountered a technical error. It had been flagged by the Federal Fraud Division due to identity theft and financial exploitation. Aaron stammered blindly in the recording. He told me fraud investigators were actively reviewing digital signatures. He said local authorities might be legally required to investigate the origin of the loan. He demanded that I call the bank immediately, begging me to tell the federal investigators that the entire situation was a massive family misunderstanding. He wanted me to call the authorities and lie on his behalf. He expected me to voluntarily cover up a felony simply because he was my son. He counted on me to absorb the absolute liability of his criminal actions, to protect the fragile, lavish lifestyle built on my stolen capital. I listened to the pure, unadulterated panic in his voice as he realized the walls of his fraudulent empire were rapidly collapsing inward. He was facing total financial ruin, forced eviction, and potential federal prosecution, all within 48 hours. The voicemail ended automatically, cutting off his desperate pleas. The kitchen returned to absolute silence. I slowly lowered the phone, placing it face down on the cold granite. I felt not a shred of pity. I had successfully audited the cascade of events leading to his downfall. Every single voicemail served as concrete confirmation of a flawlessly executed tactical strike. The digital guillotine had operated with absolute mechanical perfection. The immediate threat was neutralized. But the broader operation was far from complete. I turned away from the kitchen island and walked directly to the hallway closet. Reaching inside, I pulled my heavy wool coat from its wooden hanger. I had gathered all the necessary intelligence. The adversary was completely disoriented, and their resources were draining rapidly. It was time to leave the quiet sanctuary of my townhouse. It was time to head downtown and sit in the war room with my attorney. I slid my arms into the thick sleeves of my coat, ready to finalize the complete removal of my son from my affairs. The elevator ascended smoothly and silently to the 42nd floor. The stainless steel doors slid open, revealing the reception area of Porter and Vance litigation. It was precisely 8 o'clock on Monday morning following the holiday weekend. Receptionist was not yet at her desk. Beyond the glass walls lay a sweeping view of the frozen downtown skyline. But I didn't stop to admire the architecture. I walked straight down the polished marble hallway toward the corner office. Without knocking, I pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped inside. Stephen Porter was already seated behind his massive glass desk. He didn't offer a polite smile, nor he didn't ask how my weekend was, or did he utter a single empty pleasantry about the holidays. Dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, he was focused intently on the glowing screen of his laptop. Placed perfectly in the center of his desk was a thick printed dossier, the encrypted digital package I had transmitted to his secure server 2 days prior. "Sit down, Calvin," Stephen said, without looking up from his monitor. His voice was a flat, raspy baritone, completely devoid of emotion. I sat in the leather chair across from him. I didn't take off my wool coat. I simply waited. Stephen closed his laptop and laid his hands flat on the glass surface. He looked at me with the calculated gaze of a predator analyzing compromised prey. "I reviewed the entire package you compiled. The digital login timestamps, the network routing addresses, the scanned application from the credit union. I cross-referenced the metadata with the forged signature page and legal classifications," Stephen said, his tone matching my absolute detachment. "It's a complete disaster for him." Stephen leaned forward slightly and continued. "Your son didn't just bend a few internal banking rules. By electronically transmitting a forged signature to secure a $75,000 loan against an asset he doesn't own, he triggered several severe federal and state statutes. We are looking at aggravated identity theft and grand felony forgery. Because the credit union is a federally insured institution, the electronic submission elevates this directly to federal wire fraud. Furthermore, given your age bracket, he has officially crossed the threshold into serious financial exploitation of a senior." Stephen paused, letting the weight of the legal terminology settle in the quiet room. "If the district attorney decides to aggressively pursue this, and given the flawless paper trail you've provided, they will. Your son is looking at mandatory minimum sentencing in a federal facility. This isn't a fine, Calvin. This isn't probation. This is prison time." I processed that information with the same cold, analytical precision I used when evaluating quarterly profit margins. I felt zero instinct to protect him. He walked straight into a minefield of his own making, and he jumped right onto the largest explosive he could find. "I'm not initiating criminal proceedings today." I looked at Stephen and continued. "A criminal investigation takes months. It involves detectives, grand juries, and endless bureaucratic delays. Aaron would use that time to manipulate his wife, borrow money from her wealthy family, and craft an elaborate victim narrative. I'm not giving him a runway. I want to execute a total systemic shock. I want his entire operational reality dismantled immediately. Stephen tilted his head, a faint glimmer of professional appreciation in his eyes. He opened the file on his desk and pulled out a photocopy of the property deed. You are the primary deed holder. Aaron and his wife are legally classified as tenants at will. They have no formal lease agreement. I can draft a standard 30-day notice to quit today. Once those 30 days expire, we officially file for an eviction in county court. The sheriff's department will physically remove them in about 60 to 90 days. I slowly shook my head. 90 days is completely unacceptable. 90 days gives him a window to find alternative housing, hire defense counsel, and hide his assets. 90 days lets him breathe. I want him cut off by next week. Stephen leaned back in his leather chair, tapping his expensive silver pen against the glass desk. You want to bypass eviction court entirely? I want to liquidate the asset, I replied, my voice dropping into a hard, uncompromising register. I spent 40 years managing global corporate logistics. When a regional distribution center fails due to internal corruption, you don't spend 90 days slowly evicting the compromised managers. You dissolve the entire entity. You liquidate the inventory, sell the bare land, and terminate the lease. I don't want that suburban house, Stephen. I don't want to manage it, and I don't want to rent it out. I want to sell it. I want to sell the house right out from under their feet while they're still sleeping in the master bedroom. Stephen stopped tapping his pen. A slow, sharp smile spread across his face. He understood precisely what I was engineering. You want to sell an occupied property. In the traditional real estate market, that is a notoriously difficult operation. Standard buyers demand walkthroughs, structural inspections, and vacant, pristine rooms. They avoid occupied homes, especially when the occupants are hostile family members facing eviction. Then, we don't use the traditional market, I countered immediately. We use a corporate liquidation firm. Stephen nodded slowly, his mind retrieving the necessary files. I have an established working relationship with a private equity group called Apex Capital Holdings. They're a massive corporate entity that specializes in rapid cash acquisitions of distressed or encumbered residential properties. They buy homes entirely sight unseen. They waive all inspections. They don't care about current occupants because they retain a team of aggressive corporate litigators. Witty, whose sole operational purpose is executing swift mandatory evictions. They will buy the house while your son is sitting on the couch, and they won't hesitate to remove him. That is the exact mechanism I need, I said, feeling the sharp focus of strategy. What's the cost? The cost is the margin, Stephen explained, his tone returning strictly to business. By purchasing an occupied home sight unseen, Apex Capital takes on significant legal and physical liabilities. To offset that risk, their offer is strictly below market value. Your property is currently valued at roughly $850,000. Apex Capital will offer you 80 cents on the dollar. You will take a severe financial loss. I did the mental math instantly. 20% of $850,000 is $170,000. I would be walking away from nearly $200,000 in pure equity. For a split second, the sheer size of that loss crossed my mind, but I set it aside immediately. This wasn't a real estate transaction. This was a tactical maneuver. I accept the 20% loss, I said without a trace of hesitation. In fact, I want you to offer them the property right now, at that exact 20% discount. Don't negotiate. Don't haggle. Give them the absolute bottom dollar price immediately. Stephen raised an eyebrow. You are deliberately hemorrhaging your own capital, Calvin. You are paying a steep premium for speed. I am paying a premium for resolution, I corrected him sharply. I know how corporate equity firms operate. If we try to negotiate a fair market price, the file gets sent to an underwriting committee. Approving the funds takes 3 weeks. But approving the funds takes 3 weeks. But if we hand them a pristine property in an affluent neighborhood at a guaranteed 20% discount, their internal algorithms automatically greenlight the acquisition. It becomes an irresistible asset transfer. If we give them that discount, what is the exact timeline for closing the deal? Stephen pulled a fresh sheet of heavy bond paper from his drawer and laid it flat on the glass desk. If we offer the 20% discount today, they bypass the underwriting committee entirely. They can wire the liquid funds and execute a clean title transfer in 7 days flat. Next Monday? Next Monday, I repeated, absorbing the absolute finality of the words. By next Monday, my son will no longer be living in a house owned by his father. He will be trespassing on private corporate property owned by a multi-billion-dollar investment firm. Stephen unscrewed the cap of his silver pen. He rapidly scribbled a series of legal parameters across the blank document, drafting an exclusive expedited listing agreement right in front of me. He detailed the specific property coordinates, the exact discount at purchase price, and the guaranteed 7-day closing window. He spun the document and slid it across the smooth glass desk toward me. He set the heavy silver pen directly on top of the paper. Your son took $75,000 using a forged signature, Stephen said, his voice quiet and deadly serious. Use your real signature to clear out his foundation. I reached out and picked up the pen. The metal felt cold and heavy in my hand. I looked down at the bottom of the document, at the single black line requiring my authorization. For 3 years, Aaron and Brooke treated me like a silent, bottomless resource. They mocked me, ignored me, and ultimately tried to ruin me financially. They genuinely believed their actions carried 0 consequences. I pressed the tip of the pen to the paper. I didn't hesitate. With bold, fluid strokes, I signed my name, legally binding the complete liquidation of their entire fake reality. I set the pen back on the desk. Stephen pulled the document back. He didn't say a word. He simply turned toward his scanner, digitized the binding contract, and transmitted it directly to the acquisitions director at Apex Capital Holdings. The digital transfer took less than 5 seconds. The mechanism was officially locked in. The countdown had begun. Next Monday, the storm would arrive. The drive from the downtown financial district back to my quiet neighborhood took 47 minutes. I didn't turn on the radio. I drove in complete silence, letting the steady hum of the engine and the rhythm of the tires against the cold pavement anchor my thoughts. The meeting with Stephen had turned abstract data into a tangible resolution. The exclusive listing agreement was signed and transmitted. The 30-day eviction notice was completely bypassed. In 7 days, the acquisitions team from Apex Capital Holdings would legally own the property Aaron currently occupied. The financial axe hadn't just fallen. It severed every root supporting their stolen existence. I pulled off the main road and onto the quiet residential street leading to my townhouse. The winter sky was a flat, relentless gray, pressing heavy over the bare trees and frosted lawns. I felt a deep operational calm. The frantic voicemails Aaron left on my phone this morning already proved he had completely lost his footing. He was a man accustomed to manipulating his way out of minor inconveniences, but he lacked the internal structure to handle a full systemic collapse. He expected me to answer the phone and absorb his panic. He expected me to act like an obedient subordinate. My continuous silence had clearly pushed him to the edge of sheer desperation. As I rounded the final turn toward my property, my calm instantly hardened into absolute tactical alertness. I brought the car to a crawl. The narrow concrete driveway leading to my garage was completely blocked. A massive, polished black luxury SUV was parked aggressively across the entrance. It was parked at an angle, its rear tires crushing the frost-à-turf of my front lawn, its front bumper blocking the sidewalk. It was a deliberate, hostile display of dominance. I recognized the vehicle immediately. It was the $80,000 flagship model Aaron had leased 18 months ago, claiming it was an absolute necessity for entertaining his high-end corporate clients. He had secured the steep monthly payments using the exact same fraudulent financial leverage I had just dismantled. I brought my car to a complete stop, idling in the middle of the quiet street. I kept the engine running and observed the scene playing out on my property through the windshield. Aaron and Brooke were standing on my small concrete front porch. They weren't waiting patiently like anxious family members seeking a peaceful resolution. They paced back and forth in the limited space, like agitated predators backed into a corner. The biting winter wind was clearly getting to them, but their sheer entitlement seemed to generate its own heat. Brooke was wrapped tightly in a thick designer winter coat, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She tapped her expensive leather boots aggressively against the concrete, staring at locked front door, as if trying to burn through it with pure willpower. Aaron was in a state of constant, volatile motion. He wore a thin suit jacket entirely inappropriate for the freezing temperatures, but he didn't seem to notice the cold. My son. He held his phone to his ear, listened for a few seconds, then yanked it away and jabbed his thumb violently at the screen. He was trying to call me again, standing on my property and blocking my driveway, aggressively demanding that my phone ring inside my empty house. I sat in my idling car and watched them, assessing their body language with the same detached metrics I used on loading docks to evaluate compromised vendors. There was zero remorse in their posture. Not a shred of grief over their profound betrayal. There was only the frantic, toxic rage of parasites suddenly cut off from their host. They hadn't driven across town to apologize for forging my signature on federal bank documents. They came to corner me in my own home and demand that I immediately restore their access to my capital. They fundamentally believed that if they could confront me physically, they could intimidate, threaten, and manipulate me back into submission. They still viewed me as a weak, isolated old man who was easily broken. They hadn't grasped that the father they knew was eradicated weeks ago on an icy porch. They were currently trespassing on the territory of an adversary who had just taken a 20% loss to sell their house to a private equity firm, simply to watch them experience a rapid eviction. I released the brake pedal. I let my car creep forward until my front bumper was inches away from the driver's side door of Aaron's aggressively parked SUV. The tires crunched loudly against the accumulated road salt and frozen gravel, the sharp sound slicing through the quiet suburban air. Brooke noticed the car first. She stopped her angry pacing and locked her eyes on my vehicle, her posture shifting from defensive irritation to aggressive anticipation. She reached out and slapped Aaron's shoulder hard, pointing a manicured finger directly at my windshield. Aaron pulled the phone from his ear and turned to face the street. His face flushed, bright red from the cold and the residual adrenaline of his unchecked panic. For the briefest second, as his eyes met mine through the safety glass, I saw the raw, pathetic desperation trembling beneath his expensive suit. I saw the horrifying realization that his entire fraudulent empire was rapidly burning to the ground. But that fleeting moment of truth was immediately buried under a wave of massive, blinding entitlement. He clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into white-knuckled fists at his sides. The illusion of the successful corporate son evaporated completely, exposing the agitated, desperate offender beneath. He didn't wave. He didn't step aside to clear my driveway. He let out a visible shout of rage that bloomed into a thick cloud of white steam in the freezing air. He marched down from the concrete porch, his boots heavy on the frosted lawn, moving aggressively toward my car. My engine cut off, leaving only the sound of the harsh winter wind sweeping across the frosted concrete of my driveway. I gripped the interior door handle, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the freezing air. Before I could even close the car door, the verbal assault began. Brooke closed the physical distance between us with alarming speed, her face flushed red in the gray morning. Her manicured hands were clenched into tight fists at her sides. She didn't ask about my health, nor did she offer a single word of polite greeting. She immediately launched into a sharp, screeching tirade, her voice entirely devoid of basic restraint. She screamed, accusing me of deliberately ruining her morning. With appalling entitlement, she detailed how she had been standing at the checkout counter of an exclusive downtown boutique, surrounded by women from her elite social circle. She shrieked about the absolute humiliation of handing her platinum emergency card to the cashier, only for the terminal to violently decline the transaction. She demanded to know how I could be so utterly selfish and petty as to freeze my own line of credit without consulting her first. I stood motionless beside my car, placing my hands calmly on the cold metal of the roof, observing her the way one observes a malfunctioning piece of machinery. Her breath bloomed in the freezing air as she ranted about the deep social shame of having her designer purchases publicly rejected. She genuinely believed her temporary embarrassment at a high-end retail store was the primary tragedy of the morning. She had zero concept that the card in her hand was backed by stolen capital, or that the man standing beside her had committed federal felonies to maintain her lavish lifestyle. Aaron stepped forward and placed a hand on Brooke, pulling her back. He could see that her sharp demands were bouncing off my quiet exterior without landing a blow. He tried to quickly recalibrate the dynamic, adopting the fake authority he used when negotiating corporate sales. He adjusted the lapels of his thin, expensive suit jacket, shivering visibly in the biting wind. He looked at me with a manufactured expression of profound disappointment, shaking his head slowly, as if dealing with a disobedient child. He told me that a minor clerical error I made while handling his bank applications had caused a massive, wildly inconvenient malfunction. He claimed the bank overreacted to a simple routing discrepancy and issued an aggressive fraud alert against the home equity line. He demanded that I retrieve my phone immediately, ordering me to call the fraud division while he stood there, verbally authorized the release of the funds, and formally apologized to the bank representative for my irresponsible digital mistake. He was actually trying to convince me that the federal block on his illegal loan was entirely my fault, the product of my own incompetence. I didn't reach into my pocket for my phone. I simply stared at him, maintaining a flat, unwavering gaze. My continuous silence visibly rattled him. His corporate facade fractured violently, exposing the raw, erratic panic beneath. When he realized I wasn't going to blindly obey his verbal commands, Aaron reached inside his suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound clipboard and shoved it nearly over the hood of my car. A complex, densely worded legal document was clamped firmly to the board. He spoke rapidly, the words tripping over each other in desperate haste. He told me that since I was clearly incapable of managing my own bank applications over the phone, he had proactively brought a solution. He claimed the document on the clipboard was a standard administrative authorization. Its explicit purpose was to clear the fraudulent musprains, the $75,000, and permanently transfer primary administrative control of the deed into his name, simply to prevent future misunderstandings. He was asking me, right there on the icy concrete of my driveway, to voluntarily sign away my house and legalize his theft. I looked down at the document, then looked back up at my son. Before I could utter a word of refusal, Aaron snapped his fingers loudly toward his idling SUV. The heavy passenger door of his luxury vehicle opened, and a man stepped out onto the driveway. He didn't look like a corporate bank official or a respectable legal representative. He wore an ill-fitting, wrinkled coat, and, despite the freezing temperatures, he was visibly sweating. His eyes darted nervously around the quiet suburban street. He clutched a small, worn canvas bag tightly against his chest. Aaron introduced him with a dismissive wave, claiming the man was a licensed mobile notary, a professional he had paid a steep premium to bring directly to my property on a holiday weekend. Aaron aggressively slapped the hood of my car, instructing me to take the clipboard, sign the release authorization immediately, and let his notary officially stamp the document. The sheer audacity of this ambush hung heavy over the driveway. Aaron hadn't just come to argue. He brought a compromised notary to trap me physically on my own property. He intended to use the physical presence of three younger adults to intimidate, pressure, and actively coerce an older man into signing a fraudulent legal instrument. The notary shuffled forward, his boots dragging heavily through the frost, refusing to make direct eye contact with me. He pulled a heavy brass stamp from his canvas bag, his hands trembling slightly as he unscrewed the cap. He was clearly a man operating entirely in the shadows, likely sourced through the same shady network Aaron used to secure rapid cash loans. "Sign it, Calvin," Aaron demanded, dropping any pretense of calling me Dad, his voice a harsh, desperate bark. "Sign the document right now. You are not going to ruin my life over a technicality. You're going to sign this authorization, and we're going to act like this never happened. Or I swear to God, I will have you declared legally incompetent and take the property anyway." The threat hung violently in the freezing air, exposing the absolute bottom of his degradation. He was actively threatening to strip away my autonomy and place me in a facility, simply to maintain his access to my capital. I looked at Brooke, her arms still crossed, toxic entitlement burning in her eyes. I looked at the sweating, terrified notary holding the brass stamp. Finally, I looked directly into the bloodshot, panicked eyes of the man I had raised. They fully expected me to collapse under the pressure of a physical confrontation. They expected fear, confusion, or desperate pleas for family reconciliation. I gave them none of it. I stood tall, completely immune to the biting cold and their hostile intimidation. I reached out, and placed my bare hand firmly on the edge of the leather clipboard. I didn't pull a pen from my pocket. I simply turned my gaze toward the trembling notary. "If you dare press that stamp onto any paper on my property," I said, my voice slicing through the ambient noise of the street like a scalpel, "I will personally ensure you spend the next 10 years in a federal facility for participating in an active wire fraud conspiracy." The notary recoiled as if shocked, dropping the heavy brass stamp back into his canvas bag. He stumbled backward, 3 quick steps, shaking his head frantically in full retreat. Aaron lunged forward, slamming both hands onto the hood of my car in a blind fury. He opened his mouth to unleash another wave of desperate threats, completely unaware that his intimidation tactics were entirely useless against a man who had already initiated the total liquidation of his world. The moment Aaron processed the complete failure of his physical intimidation, he stopped his aggressive advance. He stood on the icy concrete of the driveway, breathing heavily, his chest heaving beneath his thin suit jacket. He watched the retreating taillights of the notary along the empty street, then turned his gaze back to me. I watched the frantic gears turning behind his eyes. The aggressive brute force strategy had evaporated, leaving him completely exposed. I observed a disturbing physical transformation take place right in front of me. The violent flush faded from his face, and the aggressive stiffness in his shoulders relaxed entirely. He took a slow, deep breath of the freezing air and exhaled. When he looked at me again, the panicked offender was gone, replaced by a sickeningly sweet, deeply concerned son. "Dad, you're clearly sick," Aaron said, his voice dropping a full octave into a gentle, condescending register. "You're confused. You're making completely irrational decisions, and it's starting to become dangerous." He took a slow, careful step toward me, holding his hands out with open palms, as if attempting to soothe a frightened animal. Right there on the frozen driveway, he began rewriting the reality of the past 48 hours. He told me my memory was clearly failing. With a voice dripping with feigned pity, he suggested I had simply forgotten to pay the monthly bills. He stated that the frozen credit card at the boutique and the failed mortgage transfer weren't deliberate tactical moves, but tragic mistakes made by a severely declining mind. He claimed I had logged into the banking portal and, in a state of deep cognitive confusion, hopelessly scrambled the routing numbers. Brooke recognized the tactical shift instantly. Wrapping her stepped seamlessly beside him, wrapping her expensive designer coat tightly around her waist. She looked at me with an expression of exaggerated sorrow. "Calvin, it was so embarrassing for you," she murmured, her voice trembling with fake sympathy. The cashier at the boutique was so concerned when the card was declined. She asked if you were suffering from dementia, if you had forgotten how to manage your own accounts. "We're just so worried about you, Calvin. Your behavior is so out of character. You're destroying your own life because your mind is failing." I stood motionless beside my car, my hand resting on the cold roof. I didn't blink. I didn't defend my cognitive abilities or argue against their fabricated narrative. I simply observed the suffocating audacity of their psychological attack. They stood on the concrete of a property I purchased, demanding access to capital I earned, actively attempting to convince me that my self-defense was a symptom of a degenerative brain disease. I noted the exact way Aaron gripped the clipboard, his knuckles white, fluttering slightly in the harsh winter wind. He was attempting to execute a psychological takeover. He wanted me to believe my reality had fractured, needing me to doubt the basic architecture of my own mind. It was a classic corporate gaslighting tactic designed to destabilize a target before forcing them to sign a binding contract. Aaron stepped closer, his fingers tapping softly against the leather clipboard he tried to force on me earlier. He made no mention of the fraudulent line of credit, completely ignoring the federal wire fraud I had just accused him of committing. He looked down at the dense legal document, then looked up into my eyes, with an expression of deep sorrow and heavy burden. "I brought this document to help you, Dad," Aaron said, his tone heavy with sacrifice. "This isn't an administrative authorization. It's a comprehensive, durable power of attorney. It grants me full medical and financial authority over your entire estate for your own good. You're clearly struggling to manage your daily life. You're forgetting basic financial transfers, and you're alienating the only family you have left. I need you to sign this today, so I can take this heavy weight off your shoulders. Let me step in and manage the accounts before you accidentally bankrupt yourself in a state of severe confusion." He extended the clipboard toward me, holding it out like a lifeline. He was asking me to voluntarily hand over absolute legal control of my entire existence. He wanted the legal authority to drain my retirement accounts, mortgage my townhouse, and strip my assets under the ironclad protection of a state-sanctioned power of attorney. When I made no move to take the clipboard, his sweet facade hardened at the edges. The feigned concern in his eyes crystallized into a cold, absolute threat. He lowered the clipboard slightly, bringing his face close to mine, his breath mingling with the icy winter wind between us. "Dad, I want to do this the easy way," Aaron whispered, his condescending tone dropping into a flat, ruthless threat. "I want to protect your dignity. But if you refuse to sign this document right now, you leave me no choice. I will have to call Adult Protective Services. I will tell the state investigators that my elderly father is suffering from severe delusions and poses an active, immediate danger to himself. I will show them the canceled accounts, the frozen credit lines, and the paranoid security measures you activated. I can easily find a physician willing to testify to your immediate cognitive decline." Brooke nodded slowly, stepping up beside her husband. "We'll have to do it, Calvin," she added, her voice stripped of any remaining warmth. "It will break our hearts, but we will have the state declare you legally incompetent." Aaron maintained his unblinking stare, driving the psychological wedge deeper. "Do you know what happens when the state takes over, Dad?" he asked, his voice chillingly calm. "They won't let you stay in this comfortable townhouse. They will strip away your independence entirely. They will place you in a state-run care facility, locked in a sterile room in a secure ward. Strangers will manage your schedule. They will feed you. And when you grow agitated, they will sedate you. Your entire estate will be liquidated by court-appointed guardians to pay for your confinement. You will lose absolutely everything, dying alone in a hospital bed with zero control over a single aspect of your reality." He paused, letting the vivid picture settle over the frozen driveway, believing he had engineered my ultimate nightmare. He thought he had weaponized every aging parent's deepest fear and pointed it straight at my chest. "Sign the power of attorney, Dad," Aaron commanded, his tone dropping back into a sharp, authoritative growl. "Sign the documents right now. Give me control of the banking, and I will let you stay in your house. I will let you keep your quiet little life. Fight me on this, and I swear to God you will be in a facility before this weekend is over." I stood in the deep silence of the freezing morning. A normal father might have been completely crushed under the weight of their abusive tactics. paralyzed by the fear of losing his autonomy. He would question his memory, doubt whether he had made a mistake, and reach out a trembling hand to sign his life away, just to maintain a fragile illusion of family harmony. I felt no fear. I felt only a cold, absolute certainty regarding my opponent's complete moral bankruptcy. They had abandoned any pretense of loyalty. They were hostile entities threatening my freedom to ensure their continuous extraction of capital. They were playing their final desperate card, hoping the threat of institutionalization would force my immediate surrender. They had no idea they were threatening a man who had already initiated the events that would leave them completely homeless before the end of the month. Aaron stood with his chest heaving, his breath blooming into thick clouds in the freezing air. His threat to lock me away hung between us like a physical object. He waited for fear to appear in my eyes, waiting for me to break, beg for my autonomy, and yield to his blackmail just to keep my freedom. Brooke stepped closer to him, her face a mask of toxic anticipation. I didn't flinch or raise my voice, nor did I grant them the satisfaction of a defensive argument. I simply looked at the two of them with deep, absolute detachment, like a man observing a parasite he had already cleared. The pure silence of my response echoed uncomfortably across the frosted driveway, completely neutralizing their momentum. Before responding to my son, I turned my gaze slowly toward his wife. Brooke stiffened instinctively under my clinical observation. I looked at her, not as a family member, but as an itemized ledger of stolen capital. I audited her physical presence with total precision, looking at her expensive winter coat and recognizing the Italian designer label sewn into the collar. It was a recent seasonal release heavily promoted in luxury catalogs. Knew exactly what it cost. My eyes dropped to her boots, imported calfskin, with distinctive gold hardware dull in the gray morning light, and then to the heavy luxury handbag slung over her shoulder. I completed the arithmetic in my head, my voice breaking the silence with flat, mechanical precision. "Your winter coat retails for $2,400, I stated, my words cutting clearly through the biting wind. Your leather boots cost $850. The handbag you are holding is a limited production model, priced at approximately $4,200. You are standing on my concrete driveway, wearing nearly $7,500 in retail apparel, precise items you purchased using the joint Platinum Emergency Card during your holiday shopping." "Zathan." Brooke opened her mouth to speak, a flush of anger rising up her neck, but I didn't allow her a single syllable of interruption. That line of credit was tied directly to my personal retirement reserves. I continued, my voice entirely stripped of emotion. "You didn't earn that money, Brooke. You didn't generate that capital. You extracted it from my account under the arrogant assumption that I was too old and mentally impaired to monitor my own financial structure. You believed you could bleed my resources indefinitely to fund a lifestyle you cannot afford. You feel humiliated now because that plastic card was declined at a boutique, but you feel absolute zero shame about the fact that you are actively wearing my stolen retirement." Brooke stepped back as if struck by a physical blow, her mouth snapping shut. Her feigned sympathy vanished instantly, replaced by deep, humiliated shock. She looked to Aaron for protection, but Aaron was completely paralyzed by the surgical precision of my audit, unable to defend her against the undeniable mathematical truth of their behavior. I shifted my focus back to the man I had raised. Aaron stared at me, his jaw tight, his wide eyes filled with a creeping, inescapable dread. The condescending corporate son was completely gone. The aggressive bully threatening me with a care facility had evaporated. He was finally beginning to understand that he had walked blindly into a meticulously designed trap, delivering thorning threats to a man already executed a complete systemic shutdown. I reached into the deep breast pocket of my heavy wool coat, taking my time to pull out a thick manila envelope. The paper was crisp and rigid in the freezing temperature. I extended the envelope toward him, hovering it above the hood of my idling vehicle. Aaron stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. He didn't want to take it. His survival instincts were screaming gring at him to turn around, get back into his expensive leased car, and drive away. But his desperate desire for control forced his hand forward to find out what data I held. His fingers trembled visibly as he reached out and took the envelope from my grip. "Open it," I commanded softly. Aaron fumbled clumsily with the metal clasp, his hands shaking so violently, dropped the heavy packet onto the frosted concrete. He finally tore open the seal and pulled out a thick stack of stapled legal documents, flipping to the first page. I watched his eyes scan the bold black lettering at the top of the paper. It was the official fraud alert generated by the regional credit union. A strict, legally binding statement that the $75,000 line of credit had been permanently frozen due to verifiable, documented forgery. It explicitly stated that the electronic signature failed to match physical records, and that the Federal Fraud Division had been formally notified of the discrepancy. Aaron's face turned a sickly, ashen gray as the blood drained completely from his cheeks, leaving him looking hollow and consumed by fear. His lips parted, but no sound came out. In that single second, he realized his crime was no longer a secret. It was a documented, verifiable fact sitting on federal banking servers. He swallowed hard, his throat moving visibly, and a cold drop of sweat beaded on his forehead despite the biting wind. "Turn to the next document," I instructed, my voice entirely flat. He mechanically folded back the fraud alert, revealing the second set of papers. The comprehensive, binding sales contract with Apex Capital Holdings. It detailed the specific coordinates of the suburban property where he currently lived, listing the aggressively discounted purchase price and displaying my verified signature authorizing the complete liquidation of the asset. Aaron let out a shallow, raspy gasp as he read the corporate name of the investment firm and the aggressive 7-day closing timeline. His hands began to shake so violently that the heavy paper rattled loudly in the cold air. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and completely stripped of his previous arrogance. "You sold the house," he whispered, his voice barely squeezing past his throat. "You sold the house to a corporate liquidation firm." "I sold a liability to an asset management company," I corrected him coldly. "They specialize in rapid cash acquisitions. They do not care that you are currently sleeping in the master bedroom, nor do they care about your wealthy neighbors or your country club status. They care only about the land and the structure. You do not own that property, Aaron. You never owned that property. You were merely an occupant, residing there through my charity. The second you forged my signature on federal bank applications, you completely exhausted that charity. Read the final page." Aaron slowly turned to the last document in the packet, the formal 30-day notice to quit drafted by Stephen Porter, legally tied to the acquisition contract. It explicitly stated that his status as a tenant at will was officially terminated, requiring him to remove his personal belongings and vacate the property permanently, or face aggressive corporate eviction by the new legal owners. The physical manifestation of his defeat was absolute. Aaron's knees buckled visibly, and he leaned heavily against the side of his luxury SUV, using the cold metal to keep himself upright. The arrogant corporate predator who had arrived at my home ready to put me away had completely vanished, leaving behind a broken man staring at the concrete evidence of his systemic downfall. His systemic downfall. Brooke leaned over his shoulder to read the documents in his trembling hands, a sharp, stifled cry escaping her lips. The lavish lifestyle she demanded, and the affluent suburban illusion she maintained, had completely evaporated in an instant. In one swift strike, they lost their home, their lines of credit, and their social standing. They had built a castle on a foundation of stolen money, and I had just detonated the bedrock. I felt not a single shred of pity. I had audited the failure and executed the necessary liquidation. I looked directly into my son's bloodshot, terrified eyes. He was hyperventilating, his breathing shallow and rapid as the reality of his downfall pressed down on him, squeezing the air from his lungs. I delivered the final parameters of his new reality, keeping my voice steady and free of malice or triumph, speaking with the irreversible weight of a judge, reading a permanent sentence. "You will pack your things quietly," I said, maintaining a cold, unbroken eye contact that pinned him to his car. "Or the next document I deliver will be an indictment for federal wire fraud." I didn't wait for his acknowledgement, nor did I wait for Brooke to bury her face in her collar to sob. I simply turned my back on them, walked to my front door, and unlatched the lock. Stepping into the quiet sanctuary of my townhouse, I closed the heavy door permanently, severing my connection to the parasites bleeding out on my driveway. The heavy, oak door shut with a solid mechanical click, completely sealing out the freezing air and the frantic gasps of the two people left outside. I threw the brass deadbolt with a smooth, quiet motion. I didn't retreat into the depths of the townhouse for comfort. I stood motionless in the dim foyer like a statue, observing the aftermath through the narrow vertical glass panels flanking the entrance. I became the silent witness to the complete collapse of their fake reality. Brooke broke the brief silence. Her voice sliced through the thick glass, no longer forming words, but a raw, animalistic shriek of pure desperation. She slammed her heavy leather handbag onto the frosted concrete, scraping it across the ice, and began pacing the driveway with frantic, erratic energy. Screaming toward my house, her face twisted into a mask of pure malice. She swore to destroy me, shrieking that she would hire the most ruthless corporate litigator in the state to bankrupt my estate and drag my name through the mud. She vowed to ruin my reputation among my former professional peers and strip away every asset I had saved, I watched her wave her arms in the freezing wind, completely unmoved by her performance. She had descended into pure irrationality, entirely unable to process the mathematical reality that she possessed zero leverage. She had no funds to retain an expensive litigator. Her lines of credit were permanently frozen, her assets were effectively gone, and her husband was facing federal felony charges. She was screaming into a dark void, refusing to accept that the void had already swallowed her whole. Her threats were nothing more than the dying spasms of a parasite, severed from its host. Aaron didn't attempt to soothe his wife, nor did he look at the legal documents scattered across the hood of his leased vehicle. The sheer terror in his eyes had mutated into a rigid, desperate panic. The specific panic the specific panic that drives a drowning man to push his rescuer under just to secure one final breath. He realized his physical intimidation had failed completely. His psychological gaslighting had fallen flat, and the undeniable paper trail of his forgery had trapped him in a corner with zero avenues of escape. He needed an option that could break through my defenses before the corporate liquidators arrived next week to physically remove him. Through the glass, I watched Aaron reach deep inside his suit jacket and pull out his phone. Fingers trembling so violently, he nearly dropped the device onto the frozen driveway. He didn't dial a criminal defense attorney to mitigate his exposure, nor did he call the bank to negotiate. He pressed 3 specific digits and brought the phone to his ear, marching aggressively toward my front porch, with his eyes locked on the heavy oak door separating us. I could hear his voice bleeding through the glass. He didn't use the panicked tone of a compromised offender. He instantly manufactured a sound of hysterical terror. He wept, forcing genuine tears into his vocal cords as he made a desperate plea to the emergency dispatcher on the line, screaming that he needed police and medical personnel at my address. Immediately, he recited his full name and my exact location with frantic, fabricated urgency. He began weaving a masterclass of weaponized fiction directly to civil authorities. Crying into the receiver, he claimed his elderly father was undergoing a violent, catastrophic episode. He lied smoothly, like a sociopath accustomed to manipulating reality for his own needs, telling the dispatcher I had completely detached from reality and was suffering from severe, aggressive hallucinations. He screamed that I had locked myself inside the townhouse, disabled the internal security systems, and was actively threatening to harm myself and anyone who tried to intervene. Painting a vivid picture of an unstable elderly patient with severe paranoid delusions, he claimed I was incoherently shouting about corporate conspiracies and stolen bank funds. He begged the authorities to hurry, stating he was terrified I would set fire to the townhouse or attempt a violent physical assault if they didn't arrive immediately to detain me. Brooke picked up on his tactical pivot instantly, halting her frantic screaming. She integrated seamlessly into his fabricated narrative, grabbing Aaron's arm and sobbing loudly into the phone to ensure the dispatch center recorded her dramatic wailing. She cried that she feared for my life, begging the operator to send an ambulance to sedate me before I did something tragic and irreversible. They were weaponizing the state apparatus against me, attempting to use local law enforcement and medical services as their personal enforcement mechanism. Aaron calculated that if he could convince an threat I was a violently delusional threat, they would breach the door and strap me to a gurney and force me into a psychiatric ward. Once I was legally sedated and detained for a mandatory 72-hour evaluation, he would have the operational window he needed to file his fraudulent power of attorney and drain my remaining liquid assets before the acquisition firm finalized the eviction. It was the ultimate escalation in his chain of conflict, leveraging my age and social bias against me. Believing arriving authorities would instinctively trust a well-dressed, grieving corporate sons over a silent old man locked in a dark house. I didn't panic or run to the kitchen to gather my legal documents. I simply stood in the quiet shadows of the foyer, maintaining absolute operational calm. I watched Aaron pace the frosted lawn, continuing his performance for the dispatcher, while constantly checking his expensive watch to calculate the exec's response time of the local precinct. I knew precisely what would happen when authorities arrived, expecting chaos, violence, and severe cognitive decline. Severe decline. Instead, they would find an exceptionally calm, fully coherent retired executive holding irrefutable paper evidence of federal wire fraud committed by the man crying on the driveway. Aaron wasn't summoning a medical team to save his lifestyle. He was actively summoning the arresting officers to his own crime scene. The biting winter wind continued to sweep across the residential street, carrying the heavy scent of impending collapse. I stood behind the glass, my breathing slow and precise, until I heard it. A faint, high-pitched siren cutting through the gray morning. The sound, amplified rapidly, multiplying as multiple emergency vehicles accelerated toward my location, their flashing red and blue lights reflecting dimly off the frosted trees at the end of the block. Aaron lowered his phone and stared at my front door with an expression of sheer malice, genuinely believing he had won, and that the approaching sirens signaled his salvation. I remained perfectly in the shadows, waiting for the flashing lights to illuminate the final moment of my son's complete undoing. The flashing red and blue lights cut harshly through the gray winter morning, reflecting off the frosted glass of my front windows. I stood like a statue in the shadows of the foyer, watching the street as two heavy police cruisers pulled up, completely blocking traffic, with a dark gray sedan parking directly behind them. 4 uniformed officers stepped out onto the cold asphalt, their hands resting casually near their utility belts. A woman exited the gray sedan, wearing a dark winter coat and carrying a thick plastic clipboard, moving with the tired, cautious efficiency of a state investigator. I knew exactly who she was, Diane Silva from Adult Protective Services. Aaron didn't wait for them to approach the property. He nearly sprinted across the frozen lawn to intercept them. I watched him completely abandon his stiff, panicked posture, executing a flawless physical transformation. His shoulders slumped heavily, he buried his face in his hands, and his body trembled with manufactured grief. When he lowered his hands, his eyes were red and wet, and he let out a loud, stifled sob that carried clearly through the cold air. A masterclass in manipulative behavior. "Officer, please, you have to help us," Aaron cried out, his voice cracking with artificial desperation. "My father is inside. He has completely lost his mind." The officers exchanged a quick tactical glance while Diane Silva stepped forward, clicking her ballpoint pen and asking Aaron to explain the situation. Calmly, Aaron painted a vivid, horrifying picture of a sudden, catastrophic mental breakdown, telling the investigator he had come to check on me because I had been missing appointments and acting strangely all week. Crying, he claimed that, when he arrived, I was completely unrecognizable, suffering from severe, sudden-onset dementia and violent paranoid delusions. "He thinks everyone is trying to rob him," Aaron sobbed, wiping a fake tear from his frozen cheek. "He's hallucinating about stolen money and federal bank fraud. He's screaming about corporate conspiracies and forged signatures." We tried to calm him down, but he became extremely aggressive and threatened to attack my wife. He locked himself inside the house and disabled the security system. "I'm terrified he's going to hurt himself or set the house on fire. Please, you have to hold him. You have to get him to a hospital right now." Brooke integrated into the performance seamlessly, stepping up beside Aaron, wrapping her arms around his waist, and burying her face in his shoulder. She doubled. Vikla, she trembled dramatically, playing the terrified daughter-in-law, whimpering as she told Diane Silva that I had lunged at her through a crack in the door when she simply tried to hand me a cup of coffee. She claimed my eyes were completely vacant and that I didn't even know my own name. From the silence of the dark foyer, I observed their synchronized drama with cold, clinical appreciation for the absolute depth of their degradation. They were expertly weaponizing established state protocols for elder against me. Knowing authorities arrived at these situations, mentally prepared for cognitive decline. They fed Diane Silva every buzzword designed to trigger an involuntary psychiatric hold, paranoia, hallucinations, aggressive behavior, and an imminent danger to himself and others. Aaron knew that if the police believed his narrative, they wouldn't knock politely. They would breach the heavy oak door, subdue me, strap me to a gurney, and transport me to a locked psychiatric ward for a mandatory evaluation. That 3-day window was all Aaron needed to file his fraudulent power of attorney and drain my remaining liquid assets before the acquisition firm finalized the eviction. He was using the police force as his private extraction team. Diane Silva nodded sympathetically as she listened to Aaron cry, making several rapid notes on her clipboard before turning to the 4 uniformed officers and pointing toward my townhouse. Their posture shifted instantly from passive observation to tactical readiness. Unsnapping their heavy flashlights, they began walking up my concrete driveway, their boots crunching loudly against the frozen gravel. Aaron watched them move toward my door, extending a comforting arm around Brooke, but I could see the cold, absolute victory radiating from his posture. He genuinely believed his move had succeeded, trusting the authorities were about to eliminate his problem entirely. The officers stepped onto my front porch, standing directly on the other side of the heavy oak door, expecting to find an unkempt, incoherent man lost in violent hallucinations. They expected screaming and chaos. I didn't retreat into the house or hide. I smoothed the lapels of my wool coat, took a slow, measured breath, and placed my hand on the cold brass deadbolt, ready to shatter their entire fabricated reality. I didn't wait for a heavy knock to echo through my home. Just as the investigator raised her fist to strike the wood, I turned the deadbolt and pulled the oak door open. She froze on the frosted concrete, while the 4 uniformed officers behind her instinctively shifted their weight toward their utility belts, prepared for a physical confrontation, but I gave them zero reason to escalate their tactical stance. I stood in the entryway, dressed in tailored wool trousers and an ironed dress shirt, looking at the lead investigator with a mild, courteous expression. I offered a faint smile, remarking that it was far too cold to be standing out on the concrete, inviting her into the warmth and offering to brew a fresh pot of chamomile tea. The investigator lowered her hand, her eyes scanning my face and clothing for the pure cognitive decline my son had just described on the driveway. She fully expected an unkempt, disoriented man lost in violent paranoia. Instead, she found a calm, retired corporate logistics executive offering steady, flawless politeness with the door held wide open. She glanced back at Aaron, who was still standing near his luxury vehicle holding his wife, waiting for the officers to drag me out in heavy medical restraints. The investigator turned back to me and nodded slowly, instructing the 4 officers to remain outside on the porch before stepping across the threshold into my quiet foyer. I led her directly into my formal dining room, moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man in complete control of his physical and mental environment. Indicating a heavy mahogany chair at the table, I walked into the adjacent kitchen and poured 2 glasses of hot water I had boiled earlier in anticipation of these events. I set a ceramic mug before her and took a seat across the table. She didn't touch the warm tea, instead unclipping her pen from her plastic clipboard and looking at me with a mix of professional caution and deep confusion. She stated her name was Diane Silva, explaining she had a legal obligation to investigate a high-priority report regarding an immediate decline in my mental state and a potential threat to public safety. I maintained unbroken eye contact, telling respected her professional duty. I explained that my son, Aaron, had likely told her a compelling, emotional story about a sudden tragic loss of my sanity, mentioning severe delusions regarding stolen funds and forged bank documents. Diane nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing as she tried to reconcile the hysterical son crying outside with the articulate father sitting across from her. Reaching beneath the polished mahogany table, I pulled out a heavy leather-bound binder and placed it gently beside her mug. I offered no emotional defense of my character, nor did I complain about my son betraying my trust or breaking my heart. I simply pushed the binder toward her and instructed her to open it. Diane flipped open the heavy cover. The first document eheched into the rain. The first document inside was a comprehensive 20-page psychiatric evaluation printed on official letterhead from the state's most prestigious cognitive health clinic. The medical assessment was exhaustive, documenting rigorous memory tests, cognitive retention checks, and psychological profiling. The final page bore the signature of the chief medical director, formally certifying that my mental acuity was intact and that I possessed full, unimpaired capacity to manage my financial and legal affairs. Diane carefully reviewed the date stamped at the top of the medical assessment. She looked up at me, her expression shifting from cautious confusion to profound clarity. I took a slow sip of my tea, telling her I had proactively scheduled and completed that evaluation 3 days prior. I explained that earlier in the week, I had audited our shared family server and discovered search histories showing Aaron was actively researching local attorneys, specializing in involuntary guardianship and emergency power of attorney applications. I knew that the moment I froze his fraudulent line of credit, he would retaliate by attempting to weaponize the state apparatus against my autonomy, executing a legal takeover of my estate. I had simply secured the irrefutable medical documentation needed to neutralize his psychological attack long before he ever dialed emergency dispatch. Diane Silva closed the binder, the soft thud of the heavy cover echoing in the quiet dining room. She asked no further questions regarding my mental health, nor did she request basic memory tests or ask for the current date. The 20 pages of unassailable medical documentation had completely dismantled Aaron's narrative. Diane looked out the front window, where the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers reflected against the glass, realizing in that moment that she had been manipulated. She understood that the man crying on the driveway was not a desperate son trying to save his father, but an aggressive offender attempting to use her legal authority to cover up a financial crime. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the polished table, telling her there were several additional documents behind the psychiatric assessment that required her immediate review. I informed her that the binder contained verified proof of the forged $75,000 home equity line of credit, digital timestamps proving Aaron illegally transferred stolen funds directly into his private bank accounts, an executed sales contract for his current residence, and a notice immediately terminating his tenancy. I presented her with the unvarnished truth of his neatly within criminal actions, packaged neatly within the leather binder. I asked her to invite the 4 officers into my teacher dining room so we could formally discuss arresting the man who was currently trespassing on my driveway. Diane slowly turned the heavy parchment pages of the psychiatric assessment in complete silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I watched her eyes scan the subsequent documents I had organized in the leather binder. As she processed the indisputable data, her professional neutrality broke down. Reaching across the cross-polished mahogany table, I tapped the corner of a bank statement highlighted in bright yellow. I explained that the document detailed the exact routing numbers for the fraudulent $75,000 line of credit. I watched her trace the flow of capital with the tip of her pen. Those funds didn't remain in any account associated with my name. They were immediately wired into a private investment portfolio controlled entirely by my son and his wife. Then, I directed her attention to the final section of the binder. I explained that when I initially discovered the unauthorized credit inquiry, I didn't simply freeze the account. I contacted the credit union's regional fraud division and requested the specific digital footprint of the application, sliding a sheet of paper detailing a complex series of values over to her. I told Diane that the electronic signature executing the loan was generated from a specific IP address. I watched her read the physical geographic location tied to that digital address. It didn't originate from my secure home network. That digital footprint mapped perfectly to the exact residential coordinates of the suburban property where Aaron currently lived. It was a complete, undeniable digital confession of federal wire fraud executed right from his own living room. The narrative inside the dining room flipped in a single second. Diane Silva stopped reading. She leaned back in the heavy mahogany chair, her tired, sympathetic posture as a social worker completely evaporating. In its place emerged a razor-sharp focus. She was no longer looking at a vulnerable elderly victim suffering from severe cognitive decline. She was looking directly at a textbook prosecution for severe federal financial exploitation of a senior. The tragic illusion of a desperate son trying to save his aging father shattered into 1,000 pieces. Diane realized the appalling level of arrogance displayed by the man crying on my driveway. Her jaw tightened as the insult to her profession crystallized in her mind. Aaron had deliberately summoned her here, actively trying to weaponize her agency to execute a hostile takeover. He tried to use her legal authority to lock a fully coherent man into a psychiatric ward, simply to secure an operational window to complete his theft. He assumed she was foolish enough to act on his fake tears without a single piece of verifiable medical evidence. He believed he could use the state apparatus to bury his crime. Diane stood up from the table without touching her tea. She closed the leather binder and clutched it tightly against her chest as official state evidence. She looked down at me with an expression of profound, absolute, professional respect, telling me she had investigated hundreds of cases involving entitled families of their assets, trying to strip their aging parents of their assets. She said she had seen every manipulation and every lie conceived by greedy children. In a low, steady voice, she admitted she had never seen an offender walk so blindly into his own downfall. She turned away from the table and walked down the hallway toward the foyer. The 4 uniformed officers still stood on the frozen concrete of the front porch, their bodies tense with their hands resting near their heavy utility belts, prepared to breach the door and subdue a delusional patient. Diane reached out and pulled open the heavy oak door. The freezing winter wind swept into the warm house. Aaron looked up immediately. Manufactured tears still glistening on his face, his shoulders slumping in feigned tragedy. He expected to see me dragged out in heavy medical restraints. He expected Diane to give him a sympathetic nod, confirming his father was finally safe and his financial future completely secured. Diane Silva walked out onto the porch alone. She didn't look at Aaron with sympathy. She looked at him with the cold disgust of a professional who had just uncovered a massive felony. She turned to the lead officer and pointed a rigid finger straight at my son, instructing the officer to immediately arrest Aaron for felony elder, financial abuse, and federal wire fraud. Diane Silva stood on the frozen concrete of the front porch, letting the heavy oak door click shut behind her. Aaron stopped his fake sobbing instantly. He stood up straight and wiped his eyes, expecting her to deliver the exact legal directive he needed to authorize his theft, waiting for her to instruct the officers to break down the door and drag his father out. Diane didn't look at him with sympathy. She looked at him with cold disgust. She walked down the short steps and stopped directly in front of him. "Your father is in exceptional physical and mental health," Diane stated, her voice completely stripped of warmth. "He is fully capable of managing his own legal and financial affairs. I have just reviewed a comprehensive 20-page psychiatric evaluation executed 3 days ago by a board-certified medical director." Aaron opened his mouth to protest, wanting to claim the evaluation was fake, but Diane raised a rigid hand and cut him off instantly. "I have also reviewed verified bank logs and IP timestamps regarding a $75,000 line of credit," Diane continued, her words landing like physical blows. "Adult Protective Services is formally launching a criminal investigation against you and your wife for felony financial exploitation of a senior and federal wire fraud. I have already contacted the district attorney to expedite the arrest warrants." The lead officer stepped forward, deliberately placing his hand on his heavy utility belt. He looked Aaron up and down with absolute contempt, informing Aaron that he was officially trespassing on private property. He made it clear that if Aaron or his wife set foot on the driveway again, they would immediately leave in handcuffs. He ordered them to get back into their car and clear the premises immediately. The absolute finality of the authorities turning against them shattered the last remaining link in their alliance. Stripped of all leverage and facing federal felonies, Aaron and Brooke turned on each other right in the middle of the street. Brooke slapped Aaron's shoulder hard, screaming that he was an absolute idiot for using his own home network to forge bank applications. She shrieked that he had ruined her life and destroyed their social standing because he was too incompetent to pull off a simple crime. Aaron's face twisted into a mask of pure fury. He shouted back at her, saying he forged those documents to pay off her massive, suffocating credit card debts. He yelled that her endless spending and demands for luxury were what drove them to the brink of ruin. I stood quietly behind the glass of the front window, watching their marriage completely disintegrate. They were no longer a unified front. They were two desperate, panicked offenders, screaming at each other in the freezing wind, tearing each other apart under the weight of their exposed greed. 30 days evaporated with relentless efficiency. The corporate asset management company that purchased the sprawling suburban property accepted no extensions. They didn't care about Brooke's social calendar or Aaron's desperate attempts to find legal representation. On the morning of the 30th day, the heavy tires of the county sheriff's vehicles crunched onto the familiar frosted gravel of their driveway. I wasn't physically present to witness the eviction, but the subsequent formal reports from the liquidators and the homeowners association painted a clear picture. Aaron and Brooke obstinately refused to pack their belongings, clinging to a desperate illusion that a last-minute legal injunction would save them. They were completely wrong. The sheriff's deputies offered no sympathy or extra time. They gave a strict 10-minute window to gather essential personal items before replacing the heavy brass locks. The sprawling suburban fortress Aaron tried to steal was officially taken over by personnel in tactical uniforms, while Brooke stood on the cold sidewalk, sobbing over a cheap cardboard box. Under the watchful eyes of the affluent neighbors they had spent years trying to impress, their lavish illusion completely collapsed. The Adult Protective Services investigation triggered an immediate, devastating financial cascade. Diane Silva acted with absolute professional ruthlessness. After verifying the fraudulent line of credit, federal banking authorities permanently froze all joint accounts associated with Aaron and Brooke. The capital they took from me was locked inside a federal evidence vault, awaiting a criminal trial. Their previous credit ratings, maintained for years by the capital I secretly provided, collapsed overnight. Without my retirement funds acting as an invisible safety net, their true financial reality was brutally exposed. They were burdened with massive, unpayable debts and had zero liquid assets. To any legitimate leasing agency in the state, they were complete poison. Stripped of stolen wealth and facing an active felony investigation, their options vanished into thin air. They were forced to secure housing through a predatory subprime landlord who required no standard background check. The wide, manicured lawns and quiet luxury of their affluent neighborhood were instantly replaced by the cracked asphalt and chain-link fences of an industrial zone on the far side of town. Their new reality was a narrow, run-down two-bedroom apartment directly above a 24-hour commercial laundromat. The walls were thin and stained from years of severe neglect. The heavy designer furniture bought with my funds couldn't even fit through the narrow, rotting doorframes of their new building. They were forced to abandon the luxury items on the sidewalk, where opportunistic strangers quickly claimed them. As the bank transfer from the cash buyers finalized into my private, secure account, I felt a deep, absolute sense of closure. The heavy debt of that suburban house had been surgically removed from my financial structure. The assets had been converted into liquid capital, sitting safely behind secure protocols Aaron could never breach. The parasitic connection was permanently severed. As I imagined them sitting on the stained carpet of their miserable new apartment, surrounded by the deafening mechanical roar of commercial washing machines, I felt not a shred of guilt. They were finally experiencing the unvarnished reality of their own decisions. They were living the life they truly earned. For decades, I had acted as a human shield, intercepting the consequences of every reckless choice my son made. I quietly paid his debts, funded his lavish lifestyle, and allowed his sense of entitlement to grow in the dark. That era of silent complicity officially ended. The eviction wasn't a cruel punishment. It was a forced correction of the natural order. The absolute, undeniable consequence of choosing greed over family. The absolute silence inside my townhouse was broken only by the soft, rhythmic ticking of the antique clock in the hallway. It was late afternoon, and the faint winter sunlight began dipping below the horizon, casting long, peaceful shadows across the polished hardwood floors. I was sitting in my leather reading chair, holding a warm mug of black coffee, when my phone vibrated against the side table. The sudden movement rattled the wood, and the screen illuminated the dim room. A number I hadn't seen in a month appeared on the caller ID. It was Aaron. He was calling from a prepaid phone, likely because his primary corporate line had been permanently terminated for non-payment. I let the phone vibrate against the wood for a long time, watching the screen flash with cold detachment. A normal father might have felt a sudden surge of anxiety or a lingering trace of parental duty, but I felt nothing except the calm, steady rhythm of my own breathing. I reached out, tapped the glass screen, and accepted the call. I offered no polite greeting, nor did I call his name. I held the phone to my ear in complete silence, waiting for him to speak. The sound coming from the small speaker was pathetic. A wet, raspy sob. Aaron was crying with the unrestrained desperation of a man who had hit rock bottom. "Dad, please," he gasped, his voice breaking into a high-pitched whine. "Please, you have to help us." He didn't attempt to construct the authoritative, condescending tone he had used on my driveway. He didn't threaten me with state agencies or psychiatric evaluations. The arrogant bully had been crushed under the sheer weight of his own arrogance. He was completely broken. As he described weeping into the receiver, as he described the terrible conditions of his new apartment in vivid detail, he complained bitterly about the relentless vibration of the laundromat downstairs and the freezing wind leaking through the cracked window panes. Sobbing, he mentioned that Brooke had packed her remaining designer clothes into trash bags and left him the night before, retreating to her parents' house and refusing to answer his desperate calls. He was completely isolated, facing an impending federal prosecution with zero financial resources and no allies left to manipulate. I listened to his statement of failure without interrupting, allowing him to exhaust his lungs and bleed out verbally over the cellular connection. He desperately needed me to interrupt with a comforting word, needing me to instinctively fall back into my old pattern of saving him from his severe incompetence. When I offered nothing but an impenetrable silence, his panic escalated into sheer terror. "Dad, I know I made a terrible mistake," he cried, choking heavily on his tears. "I know. I crossed the line. But the landlord here is demanding a 3-month cash deposit by tomorrow morning. If I don't pay him, he's going to throw me out on the street. I have nothing left, Dad. My accounts are permanently frozen, my credit is completely ruined, and I don't even have money for basic groceries. I'm begging you, just lend me a little for now. Just $5,000. So I have a roof over my head until I figure things out and hire a lawyer. I'll pay back every single cent, I swear on my life. Please, don't leave me homeless." His pleading echoed loudly in my quiet, peaceful living room. I sat motionless, holding the cold phone to my ear, remembering that freezing winter morning on my driveway. I remembered the exact look of cruelty on his face when he handed me the fraudulent power of attorney, the cold way he looked me in the eye and threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward just to steal my retirement. He was fully willing to destroy my entire existence to fund his luxury. Viewing the father who sacrificed everything to raise him as nothing more than an ATM requiring an aggressive shutdown. I took a slow, deep breath. The air in my home was warm and clean, and my reality was secure. I finally broke my silence, my voice calm, steady, and entirely devoid of emotion, speaking with the irreversible finality of a judge reading a permanent sentence. "I'm sorry, Aaron," I said, using the exact, cold phrasing he had weaponized against me on his porch. "I only plan for my immediate family." I didn't wait to hear the sharp gasp on the other end of the line, nor did I wait for the realization of his exile to register in his mind. I pulled the phone away from my ear, tapped the red icon, and ended the call immediately. Opening the settings menu on my device, I navigated to his contact information and permanently blocked his number with a single press of my thumb. The digital barrier was absolute. All connection was severed forever. I set the phone back on the wooden side table and took a slow sip of my coffee. Silence returned to the townhouse, settling over the room like a comfortable blanket. Evening fell quietly over the block as I sat on my quiet porch. The biting wind from the past month had finally died down, giving way to a crisp, clear winter night. The streetlights flickered on, casting a warm yellow glow across the empty sidewalk. I felt no sadistic joy in my son's downfall, nor was there any triumphant celebration in my heart. I felt only the deep, absolute peace of restored balance. The natural order of my universe had been violently disrupted by greed and entitlement, but through patient and careful removal, that order had been permanently reestablished. I didn't destroy Aaron. I simply stopped protecting him from the harsh reality of his own actions, stepping aside to let the weight of his choices fall squarely on his shoulders. He was an adult who was finally experiencing the severe consequences of his choices. I stood up from my chair and walked back into the warmth of my home, heading to my small mahogany desk to open my laptop. The screen illuminated my face in the dim room as I navigated to my secure banking portal to review the digital ledgers. The substantial influx of capital from the cash sale of the suburban property sat safely in my primary account, alongside recovered funds that Diane Silva systematically pulled from Aaron's frozen accounts during the ongoing investigation. The wealth I had spent a lifetime building, brick by brick, through decades of honest labor, was completely intact. It was no longer the target of parasitic extraction or a secret I had to protect from my own blood. It belonged entirely and undeniably to me. I opened a new tab and navigated to an international travel agency. I wasn't looking for budget accommodations or discounted flights. For 40 years, I had sacrificed my own desires to ensure my family had every advantage, postponing my own dreams to fund their comforts. The era of one-sided sacrifice was officially over. Entering my personal into the rain, international information into the bookity, I selected a month-long, first-class ticket to Europe, reserving a private luxury itinerary that would take me through the historic streets of Rome, the quiet vineyards of Tuscany, and the coastal roads of the Mediterranean. I booked luxury suites at historic five-star hotels and secured private transportation for the entire journey, watching the loading icon spin briefly before displaying a bold green confirmation. The future belonged entirely to me. Closing the laptop, I walked toward the front door. A sleek black town car was already parked at the curb outside, its headlights sweeping over the frosted lawn. The driver in a dark suit stepped out, opened the trunk, and waited patiently in the cold night air. I retrieved my heavy wool coat from the closet, draped it over my shoulders, and picked up my leather travel bag from the floor. Without looking back at the dark house, I walked onto the front porch and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me. The brass deadbolt engaged with a loud, decisive click that echoed in the quiet neighborhood. The removal of the toxic elements in my life was complete. The boundaries I drew were absolute and unbreakable. I walked down the concrete path toward the waiting vehicle, feeling the cool air fill my lungs, a man who had survived betrayal unscathed. I stepped into the warm leather interior of the luxury car and instructed the driver to head straight to the airport. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb and merged smoothly into the quiet traffic, I watched the city lights sweep past the window, leaving the dark shadows of manipulation and greed far behind. The engine hummed softly, carrying me toward a bright horizon. The quiet audit was complete, and my life was finally my own.